Hey AP World History students, welcome to another lecture covering topic 3.1 on land-based empires. In this lecture I'm going to focus on the various Islamic gunpowder empires that were some of the major powers of the era across the Afro-Eurasian world. I'll start with a general overview of many of what these places had in common and look at an exception to the rule, the African Muslim empire of the Songhai. Then I'll briefly discuss the rise and fall of Tamerlane and the Timurid Empire before moving on to the empires that rise out of the ashes of the Timurids, the Ottomans, Safavid, and Mughals. Let's get started. In addition to being Muslim, the Ottomans, Safavid, and Mughals all shared other common traits. First of all, the core members of their societies were all descended from Turkic nomads that had migrated into South and Southwest Asia during the previous centuries, and these groups all spoke Turkic languages as well. Second, all of these groups and the empires they would form were able to capitalize on the power vacuum that had been left by the collapse of the Mongol Khanates. And third, throughout their empire building, they are all noted for making extensive use of gunpowder weapons, such as artillery and cannons, muskets, and the use of professional militaries, hence why they're called gunpowder empires. One exception to this nomadic Turkic tradition was the Songhai Empire, an Islamic empire located in West Africa near the Empire of Mali in the grasslands south of the Sahara. The Songhai would replace the Empire of Mali as the dominant power in West Africa with the conquests of Sunni Ali, and they would grow wealthy through their control over important trade and economic centers like Timbuktu and Jenne, as well as the salt and gold mines that had made other empires in the region rich as heck. The Songhai were African, however, and not Turkic nor Arab, although they were devout Muslims and were patrons of the Islamic faith in their empire, as seen through their support for the construction of mosques and the establishment of schools to teach the Quran, as well as the Islamic University they financed in Timbuktu. They, like the people of Mali and other West Africans, however, did not fully abandon all their pre-Islamic traditions. Sunni Ali, for example, one of the great conquerors of the Songhai Empire, often consulted pagan African diviners, magicians, and shamans. Also, the Songhai mostly lacked gunpowder weapons, and while they are one of the great empires of the age, they would meet their defeat following the death of one of Sunni Ali's later successors. Following the death of the Emperor Askia Daud, a civil war broke out for control of the empire. The neighboring Sultan of the Kingdom of Morocco sent an invasion force to Songhai in its time of weakness. This army was armed with muskets and other gunpowder weapons and delivered a devastating defeat to the Songhai Empire that left it fragmented and weakened and a pale shadow of its former glory. Successor states to the Songhai failed to achieve the vast wealth of that empire, in part because of the increase in maritime or ocean-based trade in the Atlantic by Europeans. Europe had previously relied on the caravans of the trans-Saharan routes for imports like salt and gold and even small numbers of slaves, before the growth of the Atlantic slave trade. As countries like Portugal, Spain, the Dutch, or Netherlands explored further along the coast of West Africa, they were able to go right to the source of the goods they wanted and cut out the middleman caravans of the Sahara and the states that had earlier grown immensely rich off that trade, like Mali and Songhai. Timur the Lame, or Tamerlane, as he's sometimes called, who's pictured here as this hardcore looking dude on the left, was a Mongol Turkic conqueror and is often considered the last of the great Central Asian conquerors in the tradition of Genghis Khan. In fact, he envisioned himself as the successor to Genghis Khan and sought to restore the glory of the Mongol Empire. His conquests were violent and brutal things, however, frequently involving massacres of civilians in the Mongol tradition. But Tamerlane was also a great patron of the arts and championed literature and architecture throughout his empire. Tamerlane made extensive use of gunpowder to build his empire and to protect the Silk Roads that ran through his domain. However, Tamerlane, like many of the Central Asian conquerors before him, the Mongols included, failed to establish truly effective governments such as bureaucracies or governing elites and stable successors, and his empire mostly disintegrated after his death. The empires of the Ottomans and Safavids would claim many of the lands that had been the core of Tamerlane's empire. One of Tamerlane's own descendants, Babur, a great-great-great-grandson, would go on to found the other great Islamic empire of the age, the Mughal Empire. All right, let's start with the Ottomans. Osman I was the founder of the Ottoman Empire and a member of a Turkic tribe that had migrated into the Anatolian region, or what is modern-day Turkey, with the Seljuks. Some Turks had migrated to work as mercenaries or slave soldiers of the Abbasid Caliphate. Other Turkish groups were pushed out by drought and environmental changes, and still others were fleeing before the ravages of groups like the Mongols and some of their predecessors. In 1299, following the chaos caused by the invasion of the Mongols into the Abbasid Caliphate and the destruction of Baghdad, Osman declared independence from the Seljuk kingdom that had been established there and began to build his own empire. One of the great conquerors that would succeed him in the line of the Ottomans was Mehmed II, known as the Conqueror, seen here also with the turban. He's going to rule from 1451 to 1481, and it would be Mehmed II that led the army that captured Constantinople in 1453. They would make it their new capital of the Ottoman Empire and rename it Istanbul. Gunpowder was used to successfully grow this empire and conquer cities like Constantinople in ways that were considered very innovative at the time, such as using cannon to break the walls of the fortress city of Constantinople. The Ottoman armies were also able to build a corps of elite professional soldiers known as the Janissary. Technically, they were the personal property of the Sultan and slaves. The Janissaries were among the slave soldiers that were common in this era, and were among the most elite gunpowder units of the early part of this period. Drawn from the Christian communities in Southeast Europe, an area known as the Balkans, at a young age, the boys that would become Janissaries were converted to Islam and trained in soldiering and the use of gunpowder weapons from a very early age. Their position as personal servants of the emperor actually came with great prestige, and in most cases, it would be very difficult for a modern person like you or I to identify the Janissaries as slaves based on their prestigious and comfortable lifestyles in palaces, complete with wives and children. Mehmed used his well-trained military and mastery of gunpowder weapons to conquer lands around the Black Sea and Balkans and Southeast Europe. He also wins wars against the Venetians and forces them to pay yearly tribute to him, although the city of Venice itself was never conquered by the Ottomans. A later successor, Suleiman I, is considered by many to be the greatest sultan of Ottoman history. Under his rule, the Ottoman Empire reached the peak of its territorial control, expanding further as Suleiman led conquests into Hungary in 1526, and in 1529 laid siege to the Austrian city of Vienna. He'd fail, and later sultans in 1683 would fail again and begin losing territory to Christian Europe. Suleiman extended the empire during the 1550s, though, across much of North Africa, so that much of what is considered the modern Middle East, with the exception of parts of Iraq and all of Iran, were held within the grip of the Ottoman Empire, unifying a large section of the Arab and Islamic world into one powerful state that would last into the 20th century. During and after these conquests, the Ottomans would develop a naval presence in the Mediterranean, using their fleet to control trade routes in the Black Sea, Mediterranean, and even into the Red Seas. The Ottoman Empire controlled the important trade routes through which spices, silks, and porcelain from the East traveled into Europe and the Mediterranean world. It would be the Ottoman conquest of these routes that would serve as part of the motivation for Europeans to begin looking for new trade routes to cut out one of the middlemen they mostly considered a dire threat and enemy. All right, let's turn to the Safavids. After the Timurid Empire of Tamerlane collapsed, The region of Persia fragmented into many smaller kingdoms, and some areas were even ruled by militant religious orders. One of these orders was the Safavid Sufi order, known as the Safaviya. They followed a sect of Shia Islam known as the Twelvers, the largest Shia sect of Islam today, that believed in 12 divinely ordained successors to Muhammad, known as Imams. They believed that the 12th Imam, called the Mahdi, would return with Jesus on Judgment Day to purify the world and unite all of it into one Islamic state. Ismail I, the founder of the Safavid Empire, was raised within this group and destined to be its leader. He founded the empire by first expanding into Georgia, or the Caucasus, in a series of jihads, and then into Persia, modern-day Iran, with an army of soldiers known as the Qizilbash, the soldiers of the tribal leaders and nobles of the empire. So this early army of the Safavids was basically a feudal army and depended on the loyalty of many dozens of lesser rulers to Ismail, who was so charismatic, though, and well-loved that this was not much of a problem in the early days of his reign. After his conquest, Ismail took the Persian title of Shah, not used since the Sassanids had been conquered by Arab Muslims in 651 CE. This is one of the most notable parts of the Safavid Empire, is that it was a return to the Persian culture and traditions that had been lost through Islamic conquest. Although the empire was still fervently Islamic, it identified as Persian. Shah Abbas I ruled from 1588 to 1629 and was one of the later Shahs of the empire and is remembered for a couple things. One of those is moving the capital to Isfahan and beautifying the city there. He expanded the use of firearms and gunpowder weapons as well, and centralized the military and made it more professional and personally loyal to him. He did this by recruiting Ghulam, which were basically drafted or conscripted or slave soldiers, depending on how you want to call it, trained from Russian and Caucasian Christian boys. Caucasian as in from the Caucasus. This was similar to the recruitment of Janissaries in the Ottoman Empire, as well as in their status and role within both the military and functions of the state within the Safavid Empire. He used this new professional corps of an army to check the power of the Qizilbash, those feudal soldiers that had been a constant point of instability in the empire and a potential threat to any Shah that wasn't strong enough to keep them in line. Shah Abbas imported weapons and advisors from Europe to train the military and improve the navy, even to the point where they were able to push Portuguese merchants out of the Persian Gulf for a short period of time. Another important change imposed by Safavid conquests going back to Ismail was the spread of Shia Islam on conquered areas, often by force. At the same time, Shia Islam was also used to unify disparate groups across the empire. The legacy of this is still evident today in the fact that modern Iran still contains the largest concentrations of Shia Muslims in the world. As you can see here, Shia Muslims are most prominent in Iran, in Iraq, and countries like Bahrain, with smaller majorities in places like Lebanon and Yemen, right? But Iran today remains the stronghold of Shia Islam. Which brings us to one of the developments of the expansion of the Safavid Empire, this conflict between Shia and Sunni Islam, which is rekindled as they come into conflict with their neighbors, the Ottomans. The radical Shiism espoused by the Safavids, especially early on, brought them into conflict with the Sunni Muslim Ottomans. The Ottomans and the Safavid were destined to be rivals anyway, though, seeing as they were both expanding militaristic empires that shared a border. But the religious tensions only compounded the problem. The Safavids would lose some important battles to the Ottomans under the rule of Ismail, due to the Ottoman use of gunpowder and their better trained and centrally organized military. Those defeats were part of the motivation for Shah Abbas to modernize the military during his reign 60 years later. Throughout this imperial rivalry, the Ottomans also used trade embargoes and bans on trade against the Safavid merchants as a form of soft power to punish their neighbors in ways short of outright war. Sometimes this is referred to as armed trade. Finally, let us look at the Mughals. In the 1520s, Babur, a descendant of Timur or Tamerlane on his father's side, and Genghis Khan on his mother's side, which is some pretty good parentage, would establish the Mughal dynasty in the Indian subcontinent or South Asia, beginning his conquests at the young age of 12. India was once more fractured from the decline of the Muslim Delhi Sultanate we've talked about in earlier lectures, and its fragmentation. In 1526, Babur invaded India and defeated one of the Muslim rulers of the northern part of the country and went on to wage war against the confederacy of Hindu Rajput kingdoms, we also discussed in an earlier lecture, across the northern plains of India. Babur's conquests were in the tradition of the Mongols as well, with civilians being brutalized and massacres of non-Muslims being common. One of the great religions of India, Sikhism, was founded by Guru Nanak, who witnessed Babur's conquests and the deaths that he caused. It is thought that these brutal conquests might have partly influenced Sikhism's transition and introspection from a pacifist religion to one that was more militant and dedicated to self-defense of their religious community. Akbar, seen here with his nice mustache, Babur's grandson, ruled during the height of the empire and helped extend its borders over much of the subcontinent of South Asia. The Mughal Empire under Akbar was one of the richest and best governed states in the world. Overseas trade flourished, even with ever-encroaching Europeans like the Portuguese, French, and Dutch, and later the British, who would eventually be the ultimate downfall of the Mughals. Arab traders handled most of the overseas commerce, and local Hindu merchants handled trade inside the borders of the empire, similar to the arrangement in the Vijayanagara Empire that the Mughals conquered. Akbar's religious tolerance is considered one of his notable gifts to the empire, beyond simple expansion. He sponsored debates between various religions and tried to get religious leaders of his empire to find common ground, although unsuccessfully. During the reign of Akbar, the persecution of Hindus, Sikhs, Jains, and other groups considered pagan by the Mughal rulers declined. We can explore this more in the final lecture, however, of Unit 3 on belief systems. Aurangzeb, with the falcon here, was one of the last rulers of the Mughal Empire and inherited an empire that had been weakened by corruption and a general failure of previous rulers to keep up with the military innovations of external enemies, such as an ever-increasing European presence in the Indian Ocean in the form of private trading companies like the British and Dutch and French East India companies. Despite the instability of the empire, Aurangzeb chose to continue conquests instead of making efforts at consolidation and stability. While he was successful in his expansion of the empire into South India, his wars drained the treasury, leaving Aurangzeb and the Mughals unable to deal with the peasant uprisings that followed his conquests. Aurangzeb's rule was especially troubled because of his reversal of the policies of religious tolerance practiced by Akbar and his enforcement of a strict and pious interpretation of Islam, where persecutions of religious groups like Hindus or Jains or Sikhs continued, or returned, I should say. So that concludes our overview of 3.1. In later lectures, we'll look at how these empires in later periods would eventually decline and fall like all great states. Hopefully this gives you a good understanding, though, of the expansion and development of these gunpowder empires and helps you make some more connections between your readings and some of the other assignments we've been working on. In my next lecture, I'm going to be looking at topic 3.2 on the actual techniques of administration used to keep these massive empires under control for so long. Thanks again, guys, and talk to you soon.